Good evening. Good evening. Can you hear me? Good. My name is Michelle Holland, and I'm the Vice President of the Society for Contemporary Art. Thank you for joining us this evening to hear from artist Veronica Ryan. Since our founding in 1940, the SCA has supported contemporary art at the Art Institute of Chicago by engaging the community in a dialogue about the art of our time and by acquiring artwork that enriches the museum's collection. In the last 85 years, the SCA has acquired more than 200 works for the permanent collection of the museum by artists such as Jackson Pollock, Wayne Thiebaud, Wolfgang Tillmans, Julian Schnabel, and James Turrell. We've also presented more than 400 artist talks, free and open to the public, tonight's program included. For those of you, let's give ourselves a round of applause. For those of you who are not able to attend our SCA annual meeting and acquisition vote on May 6th, I'd like to once again share with you exciting news about our latest acquisitions and some upcoming events. We're pleased to announce the acquisitions voted by our members to be gifted to the museum in 2025. Regina Jose Galindo, Siren, and Nora Torato's I Hear You, I Hear You. Please visit the SCA website to learn more about these works and the artists. Just a few upcoming events. On Monday, June 2nd, benefactor, patron, and sponsor level members are invited to join Guy Karim Kalan Puy-Martin, along with the Arts Club of Chicago Executive Director and Chief Curator, Janine Belief, for a curator-led tour of Huguet Kalan Rive de Cour at the Arts Club. Please check details on our website if you would like to attend. There are just a few spots left. If you are not already a member or are interested in enhancing your membership, please scan this QR code, visit our website, or ask me. I would be happy to help you navigate your membership choices. Looking ahead to our 2025-2026 season, while we are still finalizing our programs and events, please take note of upcoming SCA artist talks that are already in the calendar and that, as always, are free and open to the public. SCA members are always invited to dinner with speakers immediately following each program. So here are just a few. On Wednesday, October 8th, the renowned visual artist Joan Jonas will be our guest speaker. Joan Jonas is known for her pioneering work in video, performance, and multimedia art. On Wednesday, November 5th, we're excited to welcome Jill Milady, a Swiss-Uruguayan artist known for her figurative oil paintings that blend realism with surreal and unsettling imagery. And we're delighted to announce a special program featuring Paulina Paboja, our new chair and curator of modern and contemporary art at the Art Institute of Chicago, on Wednesday, January 28th. Mark your calendars. We're working on additional public programming and we'll, of course, keep you apprised. Now, I'd like to welcome our SCA program chair, Jessica Diamond, who will introduce Veronica Ryan.
Thank you, Michelle. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you to this evening's program. Tonight we have the honor of hearing from Turner Prize winner Veronica Ryan. Celebrated for her profoundly thoughtful and evocative practice, Ryan traverses themes of memory, identity, and place. Her handcrafted work includes a wide range of materials, including bronze, plaster, marble, textile, and found object. She explores their tactile qualities while imbuing them with deeply personal and universal significance. Through sculpture, installation, and assemblage, Veronica delves into the interplay between fragility and resilience, inviting audiences to reflect on the intimate connections between materiality and the human experience. Over the course of her distinguished career, Veronica has earned widespread acclaim for her innovative and poetic contributions to contemporary art. Her recognition at the 2022 Turner Prize winner solidifies her place as a leading figure in the art world, lauded for her installations that bridge past and present with unparalleled sensitivity. In addition to this prestigious honor, her works have been exhibited internationally, with pieces held in collections such as the Tate, the Museum of Modern Art. Most recently, she opened her first U.S. solo museum exhibition at the Pulitzer Arts Foundation in March in St. Louis, presenting over 100 works across 4 decades of her practice. Tonight, we have the privilege of hearing directly from Veronica. Please join me in giving her a warm Chicago welcome.
That was very nice. Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here. Thank you very much for coming. It's an honor. Thanks very much. There's so much to say that I've been having trouble thinking about where to start and where to end. So I've written quite a lot of notes, and I thought I might look and choose parts of the notes, but I think I might actually read some of the notes I've made. And some of the thoughts are quite abstract just in terms of how I've been putting thoughts together. But one of the things I will say is that a lot of the work isn't linear, and there's a lot of missing work. So I thought I might call this presentation Retrieval. And I've got a proverb here that I thought could be a nice start. And it's, all the flowers of all the tomorrows are in the seeds of today. And that's a proverb. And then I've got something I wrote a number of years ago, which was part of an installation in England. And I was re-looking at it the other day in relation to another exhibition. And so this is, I think it bridges the gap between some of my earlier work and some of the current practice now. And so this is inside and outside merge. Which is inside and which is outside? Where are the boundaries? Liminal spaces, time, place, and locations. Reality and outside of reality, definable and not defined. A shrine, alcoves, perhaps. And so amongst that, I've just written, I haven't decided to talk about individual work because we would be here forever with me describing individual work. So I thought about, the most significant event really at the moment is the exhibition at the Pulitzer. And it's brought up, since the Pulitzer really is a collection of over 40 years' work. It's brought up lots of memories of things that have happened over that time. But some of the work here is some of my undergrad work and some of the work that I made at the Slade. So, in fact, some of the images you'll see span a longer period of time. And also, I don't, some of the work isn't chronological because the way I work often is I'll work on 4 or 5 things at the same time and then come back to some of those over a longer period of time. So, in fact, it's quite difficult to have a linear representation of the work. And then when I said retrieval, a lot of work is missing. There was a fire in Montmartre. It was a big, one of the main storage spaces in London with artists' work. And so a whole decades of work disappeared in that fire. So there's a lot of work missing. So the idea of retrieval is just thinking of what is lost, and in some instances, thinking about memory and how we think about things in a wider context of loss and memory and retrieval and so on. but also thinking about the ways that now when we think about the possibility of recovery, we're also thinking about computer systems and the way that information is stored and retrieved and updated. But I also think about histories, about the environment, and about raining microplastics, and how that we're in an environment which both literal and metaphorical has the sort of resonance of how we are destroying the planet, how we're destroying ourselves, and about psychological and literal trauma and world events which are catastrophic. So the way I work is that I think about, I might have a thought, but the thought might just find its way in terms of a material. So for instance, there was a long period where I didn't really have many resources, but I was really excited by a lot of rubbish and disposables outside of shops. So one of the works is I collect lots of rubbish, essentially, and I know you call it trash here, but it has its roots in early childhood. But so there's work where I've collected a lot of apple packing cushions, and works where I've collected a lot of avocado trays, and collected other paraphernalia. So it might be bottle tops or plastic bottles. And so one of the things at the moment is in my building in New York, we have to move a lot of stuff away from the windows because they're going to be putting new windows in the building. The contractor came and looked at the space and said, oh, you're going to have to move this. We're going to need to have 8 feet away from the windows. And it's a nightmare thinking about how on earth am I going to move bits of paper, bits of twigs, string, all kinds of paraphernalia that look ostensibly like rubbish, but are in fact things that I collect that might end up in work at some point. And so some of the thoughts while I'm working might move around thinking about time, thinking about space and time, timelines, thinking about the interior, memory, time collapsing, collapse, landscape and architecture, structure of moments, trajectories, thinking about, there's one work which isn't here called Trickstify. And so one of the idioms that my mother used quite a lot when she was describing something disagreeable was, oh, dem Trickstify man. And I think when we were children, we were quite embarrassed because none of our friends at school in the countryside where we lived had a patois. But I'm really excited that I grew up in a family where I learnt cultural idioms, and actually they've become part of the conversation of my work, especially as my mother died over a year ago. And so I'm thinking about my mother all the time, actually, and that she's been quite an essential part of how I've become an artist. And so, but to think about Trickstify, she would talk about people who were doing something malevolent, and she would say, oh, they Trickstify. And so one of the sculptures I've made, my mother made multiple things. So although she made all our clothes and made exquisite quilts. She would also make multiple things. So she made, I don't know how many pincushions. And so I would say to my mum, oh, can I have some of those pincushions? And she'd want to know what I wanted them for. And in the end, she would let me have some. So one of the works is I sewed a whole group of pincushions together, and then I've added some to make some that I've made to make a particular structure. But they've all got a sewn bit in the middle, so they look like belly buttons. But so I thought it was one of the works that exemplified some of the idioms that my mother used all the time. But also thinking about Trixtify as a cultural manifestation in some traditional societies. There would be space where the trickster could evoke tricks, and it was embodied into part of the society. And I'm sure that's where Shakespeare got his idea of the trickster from. But so going on about moving on back and forth as I tend to work, my mother would talk about how we reap what we sow. And so thinking about the unruly object, the disagreeable object, thinking about Giacometti's sculpture, which was actually, disagreeable object, but the title of my exhibition at the Pulitzer is the unruly object, I'm mixing up all the idioms, but essentially thinking about how Giacometti and some of the artists, I mean, his early work, he was looking at surrealism quite a lot, but also he would have looked at West African art. The disagreeable object that I'm thinking of looks like a kind of penis, I should say, but it has little nail bits sticking out of it. And he talked about it not, I just found a quote where he was talking to his dealer about objects without pedestal and without value. I found that interesting because I never use pedestals, or I don't like plinths in the work. I don't like, for me somehow a white plinth makes the objects disappear. So some of my early work, I've made pillows and then placed groupings of objects on the pillow. So the pillow might evoke the idea of a landscape, or it might be a dream state, but also thinking about the way we dream. And as a child, I had the idea that the dreams were in the pillow. And so that's become, because I tend to make multiple things, actually rather like my mother, I often think about how I situate groupings of these objects together, which group they might belong to, and using a whole variety of materials to see how they might embody a conversation together, or how some objects might remain fragmented. So I think part of what I also do is I make fragments of things. And sometimes the fragments never come together, they remain as fragmented elements. And so one of the, I had an exhibition at Spike Island, and the title of my exhibition there was Along a Spectrum. So typically when one talks about along a spectrum, people thought I was talking about particular mental health states, about, but in fact, I was not thinking about one state. It was thinking more about multiplicity and not a singularity, that we're about interconnected states, that the way that as people we all inhabit the world and that we're all responsible. And so thinking about, in a metaphorical sense, that we're in a way responsible for the environmental catastrophe with microplastics and polluted water, and particular regions where, according to one's economic status, one is more susceptible to pollutants and particular kinds of illnesses. So I'm very interested in the how we inhabit the world psychologically, socially, and how we pay attention to particular regions in the world that are troubled in war situations, and then other parts of the globe are somehow ignored. So I think social media is also very responsible for the way that we're dealing quite a lot with notions of truth and fiction, which is reality, which is real. So the whole notion of how we exist and how we interpret our realities vis-a-vis our environment, I think, are some of the concerns in the work. So I've got a list of notes thinking about travel, weave-in moments, things not linear, how we construct meaning, teasing out meaning, moments of realization and piercing together, multiple conversations, histories, what we inherit, and thinking about literal and metaphorical inheritance. And thinking about my mother in terms of how, as children, she would dry herbs and hang them in the kitchen. And so one of the herbs, I've made some work with orange peel, and both my mum and my aunt, they would hang orange peel and then have tea sometimes. And I've made some work with orange peel, but just thinking about how as children, when your friends came round and you had different kind of cultural mementos in the home, and the way that one's friends would want to know, oh, what's that? Why do you have that there? This, that, and the other. And so one of the things that I've been interested in is the notion of cabinets and display. So my mother and a number of her friends, my mother had cabinets, and she would crochet doilies and have objects that sat on top of the doilies. So they would range from birds, glass birds, plastic flowers that she made in paper. And when our friends came round, they would notice that some of the display things in the home were different to the things that they had in their home. And so seeing that was a way that my mother established her own aesthetic, her own display, things that were valuable to her. She displayed on these doilies and her special plates and cups and so on. But one of the things my mother did, she kept one of the projects I made in my first year at Art College. The project profile was to make a tea set a non-functional tea set. So I made a group of cups and a teapot, but they actually were more like sculptural objects. You couldn't possibly have tea or pour liquid out of any of these. But my mother kept that and in her special cabinet. And so there are all these sort of special moments, thinking about my mother and her legacy and her passing on memories and her childhood, things that she remembered from the past and that she taught me how to sew. So I have a kind of cyclical, there's a sort of evolution in a way which is part of how I work in making sculpture, drawings or whatever, moving back and forth, thinking about things that how my mother taught me to sew and how she didn't always like things I made. There's one when I was on my foundation course, we had to learn, one of the things we did was life drawing. And so my mother went into my room and got my folio out, my portfolio, and she had no idea there would be nude people in there. And so she was showing these drawings to her friends, and then when I came home, she was really cross with me. She said, "Oh, this is what you do at art college, you're drawing naked people." And I said, "Well, Mummy, why did you just go through my portfolio?" And anyhow, so there were lots of these exchanges with both my parents. My father, in the beginning, was suspicious that I had lots of rubbish in my bedroom. I collected stones, bits of paper, all kinds of rubbish. He couldn't understand why my room was full of rubbish. And he would try to tidy it up and just thought I was, vermin will appear and so on. And that going to art college, he thought, oh, I was going to be making idols. And I thought, yeah, that's what I'm going to do at college. I'm going to make idols. But I find that interesting in terms of traditional societies where objects were made very much within a cultural paradigm. So I think later on, just thinking about what my father was evoking and what he meant, but actually, in the end, both my parents were very proud of me. And my father, when I moved to New York in the early late 90s, he wrote letters saying, oh, he hoped I was able to get on with my work. And so it's really interesting seeing these paradigm shifts and parents understanding from a different cultural perspective that this is how things worked in England, different to how things worked when he was at school in Montserrat. So thinking about Montserrat, I see that I have a kind of triangular history in the sense that I was born in Montserrat. My parents went to England when I was 1.5. And I grew up my parents moved around quite a lot. And I see an analogy with the way I move around in the work with ideas and move into different places that I've, on some level, inherited the way that my parents moved around. There were various reasons. First of all, my parents ended up having 8 children. So they had to move to larger spaces, and then so moving forward, the sculptures which are in Hackney, which is commemorating Windrush, was also part of Britain in the 50s, when people from the Caribbean were coming to England, and people have been travelling much earlier than that, but there was that whole period where there was people coming on the Windrush, and they were invited to Britain to help build up the infrastructure after the Second World War. And of course, families had lots of difficulties, and people found that, the idea of rather like America, I suppose, where the notion of milk and honey, people were going to find good jobs and nice homes, and the reality was quite different. So I've grown up seeing my parents and my parents' generation grow up in a society which was often quite hostile. So it was really nice to be invited to make the Windrush sculptures. And a few months before my mother died, she kept saying, "Oh, my friends keep saying, oh, they're going to take me to see the sculptures." And I said, "Well, Mummy, I'll take you." And so she was really, that was her way of saying, why wasn't I taking her? So I took my mum to see the sculptures, and she was really pleased to see that her cultural background was part of my inheritance, because as we spent most of our growing up in England, and my parents' childhood was in Montserrat, even though they had particular memories, we went back to Montserrat at one point. I think my father thought that dealing with all the problems in England, he was just going to take the family back to Montserrat. And of course, you could never go back to the same pond. So then we all came back to England. But it's interesting seeing how memory and thinking about how we embody our realities, the notion of the extended self, and thinking about key moments in one's evolution as a child and an adult, and having my own children, in fact. So when I see that there's a kind of parallel, which I only thought of just now, was that my parents went to England with me when I was a baby, and then I had my children when I came to New York. And so there's a kind of parallel with introducing different cultural paradigms. And it's a thought that just occurred to me now. But before there were some other things I wanted to say in my list about the state of pathologies, thinking about the way we're living in a moment of particular catastrophic events, and how we manage some of the situations we're dealing with, how we continue in a daily function in a daily way with some of the very complex issues which don't really seem to have any immediate solutions, how we tackle a situation which isn't part of history, it's part of our current reality. Of course, history informs the situations we're witnessing and dealing with in our lives, but the level of malevolence and the kind of dysfunction is also part of the conversation in my work. It's quite salutary to think about how we manage our lives, and thinking about volcanoes, for example, is thinking about ruptures and fragmentation, and thinking about the volcano in Montserrat. So I make connections with different kinds of moments, different kinds of topographers, and I mentioned the volcano in Montserrat because my mother thought that it was God's intervention. My mother was, as well as growing up with inherited cultural system beliefs. My mother was, as my parents were Seventh-day Adventists. It was interesting to see that they also, my mother in particular, held on to quite traditional belief systems. So she would say, and she would believe, that God had intervened in Montserrat with the volcano because of particular kind of family histories and occurrences, and she felt that God was making a point. And then before the volcano, I started to think, I wanted to go back to Montserrat to have a sense of the culture, because it was seen as the second Emerald Isle, because the Irish were on Montserrat for the longest period of time. The French and Spanish were in Montserrat at various points. And my mother didn't want me to go back. And so once the volcano occurred, she thought that was a sign that actually I wasn't meant to go back. I've recently seen a documentary of the part of the island, Soufriere Hills, where the volcano is, and it's still active. And I was astonished to see the huge estates that people built on such a tiny island. It's one of the smallest islands in the Caribbean. But then people had these enormous estates, and the person who was doing the documentation, he was going through some of the houses, and it's quite remarkable seeing the wealth, and then which wasn't commiserate with the the way people live quite humbly on the island. Some people didn't have jobs, or some people had farms and had their own homesteads and just lived in, quite modest lifestyles. And then I think partly because the Beatles had their recording studio there, there's a lot of visibility. But I could see why my mother would say, oh, God intervened, because there was this sort of disjuncture. Anyhow, that's part of thinking about how when I'm making work, I might have an idea about something that's occurred in my environment, a response. But often the material, the aspect of, or just the involvement with a particular material might determine the direction that the work goes in. And so I like the idea that my work, the things I make, in a way talk to me. They might suggest to me how I need to move on with the work. And I could see, I make connections with that way of thinking and thinking about traditional societies, where often there wasn't a word for art, but objects were made in relation to initiation rites and different cultural systems. So one of the I started an MPhil and didn't complete it at SOAS because it meant that in terms of finding money to go off and do field research, you had to write a chapter and for grants and so on. And so I found that that seemed to be taking over the reason why I wanted to do research in the first place, that I was getting very involved in fundraising to go and do field research. But one of the things that came out of doing some of the research at that time was looking at Lager culture in the southern eastern Cameroon. and Lager culture. And I liked, in particular, without going into all the complex systems of how the society evolved, I was particularly interested in the fact that gourds were part of the ceremony and celebration, but you could also use perfume bottles and light bulbs, and they would have the same semantic equivalent in a kind of metaphorical way. So I like the idea that these different objects could be used to have the same signifier, the same meaning. So in a way, I feel quite comforted in the fact that I'm able to use lots of different kinds of seemingly unrelated materials, but they could have a coherence in terms of a thought process. I've also been thinking about Yoruba culture and thinking about Mami Water. She is, and I see that Mami Water is also a mermaid goddess who's also in other parts of the globe, in Asia as well as West Africa. But I was thinking about Mami Water just recently in terms of a female spiritual entity, and that she represents good, but she could also be malevolent if she felt fit. So I suppose, in a way, thinking about my mother, I have a lot of my mother's plants, but thinking about how I keep my mother's memory alive, and thinking about my mother would not like the idea that I was talking about her in relation to Mami Water and spirit goddesses. But for me, I see an interesting parallel in terms of the extended self and how we embody different paradigms. And it wouldn't matter how much I explained to her what I meant. She would think it was blasphemous and I should go and pray. And but I, for instance, even just thinking about Haiti, for example, and how objects, and thinking about Catholicism, and thinking about how objects are used in a kind of ritual or ceremonial way. I find interesting parallels between the West and the global South, and how we're hopefully, seeing interconnected realities, that we don't exist in a separate domain, and that a lot of the conflicts we've been dealing with since the beginning of time has to do with these sorts of differences, sort of psychological dis-ease or discomfort, and thinking about how far is this human nature, that we might become enemies with our next door neighbor because of the extent of a conflict, how it could become so chronic that we just kill each other. So I am interested in paradoxes and contradictions, and see parallels with ecology, and see that there's a way that there's a coherence in that respect in how we manage our relations with each other. So the work is abstract, but it does have these correlations. It's thinking about cuts in education. I see it both in America and Britain, that some of the cuts tend to be within the arts, and that so young children are not often are deprived of their natural creative impulse in some instances. So according to where you live, you might have less resources in schools, and so it seems to be up to parents quite a lot as to how far they might be able to provide materials for some schools. But the idea of separating art, the notion of art, from music and physics and chemistry and geography, for me, is a false separation, because all the subjects belong together. To see how, because to be creative, one has to have a measure of hypothetical thinking to see how, even just thinking about how you mix colours and the chemical property of mixing particular colours together using soil or calcium or plants and so on. There is a chemical, it involves chemistry and thinking about stratas, thinking about land stratas, for example, looking at, one could, children understanding the geography of place and how you measure time, looking at tree roots and tree rings, understanding communication between trees, for example. There's a whole period with the oak trees having, a disease killing out trees, but then root structures would send information to other trees to let them know that, there's this sort of fungal or bacteria and so on. So the connection between the supposed natural world and the notion of art being a kind of separate, that it's a luxury, not seeing that actually all these different modalities belong together. So those are some of the things I'm concerned with thinking about my own work. I'm thinking too about the idea about us sowing seeds, and at the moment, I'm growing a number of mango trees in the kitchen, and I'm fascinated how they like the light in the kitchen. But I have to cut the outer shell to get to the actual seed inside. And I find it fascinating that some of the seeds will send up a little shoot, and then others would have fungus. So thinking about the way that when we sow seeds, we might be sowing some seeds that flourish and other seeds that just die. And actually some trees, thinking about some of the trees I've been looking at that are toxic, and we're not always aware. I mean, even a plant like the lily bluebells, not bluebells, bluebells as well have some toxicity, and thinking about the other lilies, I'm forgetting the name of them, but reading actually that one should wash one's hands before eating if you're handling particular plants, that we know that foxgloves and particular plants are poisonous, but so many more plants are poisonous than we're aware of. And so thinking about a longer spectrum of these different kinds of modalities, these different states of being, and about psychological subtext, how we thinking about during COVID was a moment where people understood about their own mental health condition. People couldn't go out, and there's a high suicide rate amongst teenagers, and thinking about information that became much more visible. But now that COVID is seemingly in the past, a lot of the awareness of mental health, for example, has started to go under the carpet again. And so seeing heightened states of catastrophes like COVID meant that there were moments where there was some community spirit, and then it seems that disappears quite rapidly when there isn't the extreme catastrophe. I tend to think in kind of an abstract way, and thinking about these different connections, and thinking about some of the artists who have been important to me as well. So as a student, I wouldn't have known about Senga Nengudi, for example, or Marin Hassinger, who are artists whose work I find really compelling. Of course, I started to be aware of Eva Hesse, whose work I love and still love. And of course, in England, I would have known Barbara Hepworth, but even then, you wouldn't have seen many women artists. So you saw Henry Moore and other male artists, and it's interesting to see paradigm shifts now where people are understanding Barbara Hepworth much more, and how Henry Moore didn't always include her in competitions, and so on. I mean, there are specific examples. I'm just giving a kind of broad brush about who was visible, not visible, and there certainly weren't many women artists visible. And certainly when I was growing up in Britain, at that time, you didn't see many non-white artists or people in the media. And so, we see moments of trying to redress invisibility, and of course George Floyd was pivotal in that whole period when people were at home still, and George Floyd was killed, and then you saw a whole moment of awakening. But then I feel as though one can't become too comfortable, because you could see things sort of shift about, and moments of high visibility could still become moments of not terribly visible. So I am interested in, I'm not, I don't make figurative work, but the way I work embodies a lot of the thinking about these different cultural and when I say political, I don't make overtly political work, but the work resides within social constructs, understanding behavior, and what drives a kind of political motivation. I saw one of my exhibition at the Pulitzer, thinking about how it's engendered different ways of thinking about work that's missing, and how what you do with missing, lost parts of one's history. That it also makes me think of historical loss, and how we retrieve memory, and some of the memory doesn't exist, and how we fill in gaps, how we construct meaning around the lost parts of history. I saw, anyhow, I think that's all I want to say at the moment, but I saw a fantastic exhibition at the Wexner, Nancy Holt, where my exhibition is going on to next after the Pulitzer. I think that's probably all I'm going to say at the moment.
Hello, good evening. Thank you for your talk this evening. It was lovely. My question would be, having a mother who was intensely creative, but also intensely religious, how did that help shape you as your own artist and as your own person?
Well, I rebelled. And I left home and went to art college. So I think being able to leave home is really important, and to be with one's peers. And but it actually the religious side didn't ever go away. My mother would always question my own belief system and how I could set a better example for my siblings by following my parents' pathway. It was interesting, my mother wasn't terribly religious when we were younger. My father was the more religious person. And then as my mother got older, she became much more religious. And my father was much more generous in his thinking. He wasn't, and I think because it was after some incidents that occurred, and I think he realized that by being rigid in his thinking wasn't the best way actually to get his children to agree with their religious path.
Thank you so much. You've said fascinating things. Can you give me an example of your thinking process and how it results in one of the objects that you create?
Okay. So let's see if there's one in particular. So the work, some of the work gets made over a period of time. So there's sometimes year gaps between coming back to a particular work. So I'm just thinking of one in particular. So, for example, these are family photographs, and so thinking about some incidents in my family, some quite tragic incidents, but thinking about, I mean, these are the most figurative works I've made, where the house we lived in, Hertfordshire, I remember the first house, and so events which has meant that I've obliterated faces because of things that have occurred, and this is one of the occurrences. So I think without being literal, finding ways to talk about tragedy without talking about the tragedy. So this is, my mother had a thing about people stealing her photographs as well. And that's me, by the way. When I first few years coming to New York. But thinking about how one might, so the voice in one's head might in some instances be seen as a ghost in one's head, or it could be seen as, thinking about mental health, for example, and thinking about how one could be described as schizophrenic or bipolar, or have a prescribed mental illness, because one might describe particular states where it might be a reverie. The idea of thinking, oh, you carry yourself around with you, I think is quite a poetic notion. But if you're describing this to a psychiatrist and they're thinking that, oh, this is a symptom of seeing other behaviors that might be ascribed to a pathology. So thinking about some of these different cultural paradigms about how, about medication, and thinking about cocktails that, thinking about cocktails of medications that don't work for people, and how different cocktails could precipitate different physical side effects, and then the side effect might be construed as being part of the illness. So thinking about traditional societies where, some of the healers knew which herbs might be helpful in creating a calmer modality and so on. So I don't know if that's even answering your question, but thinking about how one might come back to a set of photographs and wonder, why am I so intrigued by that photograph? But in fact, I was also fascinated by the wallpaper. And I'm forgetting the name of the writer who's talked about the wallpaper evoking states, becoming a more animated part of the room. So I think it's just a kind of reverie with states of mind. But for example, the previous work, because I collect seeds, I started making work sewing the seeds in fabric, but also thinking about the way slaves, for example, and how in different societies people might move seeds from one culture to the other. So women often hid seeds in their hair and would plant them in a different region. So I think there's some of these different thought modalities in terms of me sowing seeds in fabric, that under the right conditions, the seeds would force themselves through the fabric and germinate or not. So it's sort of thinking about these different kinds of conditions so maybe there isn't one way that the work gets made. It might be that I go back to something. For example, thinking about my mother's pincushions and the fact that we have to still go through my mother's things, and I've made a work with lots of her pincushions, and then we'll go back and then we'll find another bag with multiple pincushions. So thinking about what that meant to me, and my mother made lots of bags, and then if I said, oh, well, can I have a bag? Well, what do you want it for? And then she knew that she had to let go of these multiple things, but found it hard to let them go. So the way of thinking is rather that, thinking about multiple things, multiplicity, thinking about not a singularity, thinking about language and meaning, how we perceive our reality or not. So then the thinking becomes a kind of confluence of these different ways of working out a meaning. So there isn't one way often that the work gets made. It's through thinking about these different moments of how things come together or not.
I think that's about all. Oh, one more. This is last question, and then we'll have to end.
Oh, thank you. I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the quality of delicacy and intimacy of the scale that you're working a lot of the time. I know you have some large scale work, and definitely they're often like seem to be kind of chattering with one another in the same space, like many small things. But I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
That's quite a hard question, because how does one talk about intimacy in the work? And sensibilities and facility. I think that, and poetry and so on. I think I think that's a more ephemeral question. I think it's to do with it might partly be to do with facility, that I learned how to, on my undergrad course, fine art course, I learned to use clay, I learned to carve, and I learned to sew with my mother. So I think it's more to do with, I don't think I make the intimacy. I think it's something that is embodied in the work. So I think it's really nice that people respond to that, but I don't think I sit down and think I'm going to make an intimate kind of sensitive work. I hope that just comes out of the process of thinking and working through an idea in the work. But it's an important question.
I think that's a wonderful way to end the lecture. Thank you so much, Veronica, again.